Thank you all for being here. This is the last session of the 25-26 HISTEPS program. Thank you for joining us on a different day of the week than usual, and also at a slightly different time than the usual time. Today, I am very, very happy to welcome two speakers, Lucie Fabry Sophie Roux, that I am going to present. Lucie Fabry is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the Université de Bourgogne, where she's currently the head of the philosophy department, if I'm not mistaken. Lucie, are you the head of the department? Yeah, okay. She's coordinator of both the steering and the scientific committee of the Bruno Latour Archives in Dijon. She also is a coordinator of HISTEPS, the research network on the history and the methods of historical epistemology. She has held several research positions, including at the Centre Marc Bloch in Berlin and at the Centre Gilles Gaston in Aix-Marseille. Lucie's research focuses on epistemology and the history of science in France since the 20th century. She develops this work and this research within the framework of a comparative epistemology of the natural sciences and the social sciences. She has published on several topics, including French epistemology, where she discusses the work and the views of Gaston Bachelard, Claude Lévi-Strauss. She has a book in preparation on Claude Lévi-Strauss, and also Jean-Claude Passeron and Bruno Latour, among others. Sophie Roux, she's a full professor of history and philosophy of science at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. She has been director of the graduate program in humanities and social sciences and the director of the research team, La République de Savoir. Sophie held positions at several institutions, including the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, the Centre Alexandre Koyré, and at the University of Grenoble. Sophie's main research interests are in the history of early modern science and early modern philosophy, and more specifically, the history of Cartesianism and anti-Cartesianism in France. She has written papers on the philosophy of science, but also on the history of philosophy of science, and she has also a strong interest for French historical epistemology, and it is this common shared interest, overlapping interest between Sophie and Lucie that brought them, I believe, to work on this co-edited book that they made together with several authors. So the book is called Bachelardismes et anti-bachelardismes, controverses épistémologiques des années 60, which was published last year by Classic Garnier. So the session will unfold as follows. Lucie is going to start by presenting the book, its structure. Then she will pass it over to Sophie, who will give a first short talk, drawing from her own contribution to the collective volume, and then the floor will return to Lucie for a second short talk, also drawing from her own contribution to the book. And then the floor will, as usual, be open to at least an half an hour discussion later. So please, Lucie, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. I will try to share my screen. Yeah, can you see it fully? Yes. Is it okay?
Yes.
Thanks. So thank you, Matteo, for this invitation. So this collective volume is in French. And Sophie and I are here to present it to you in English in order to convince you that it is worth the effort to read it in French. So the aim of this volume is to study the diverse receptions of Bachelardian epistemology. So Gaston Bachelard died in 1962. And it was primarily in the years following his death that his epistemology gained widespread recognition, becoming something of an essential reference in France during the late 60s and 70s. And Canguilhem especially contributed to this renown, notably by editing L'Engagement rationaliste, a selection of Bachelard's papers gathered under a title chosen by Canguilhem, which we could translate as The Rationalist Commitment. And Canguilhem also published a series of studies on Bachelard and refers to his work in his Philosophy of the Life Sciences. In the same movement, at Canguilhem's invitation, Dominique Lecourt published L'épistémologie historique de Gaston Bachelard in 1969, which offered a synthetic presentation of Bachelard's work and popularized the expression of historical epistemology, presenting Bachelard as the first proponent of a new way of studying the sciences and their history. So Bachelardian epistemology, which was then included in philosophical textbooks, was discussed in a wide variety of intellectual circles. So references to Bachelard were made, especially when someone intended to question the scientific nature of new disciplines or question the obstacles faced by these disciplines and the conditions for scientific progress. Within French Marxism, this reception of Bachelard's works developed particularly under the impetus of Louis Althusser and the other, some of his students, the members of the epistémologie circle at the École Normale Supérieure. And the reference to Bachelard is central to For Marx and Reading Capital, both published in 1965. In sociology, in 1968, Pierre Bourdieu, Jean-Claude Passeron, and Jean-Claude Passeron gave Bachelard a prominent place in the craft of sociology when they wondered how sociology could become a science. And this is an undertaking we could, in some respect, compare with that of Gilles Gaston Granger a little earlier, when he wrote Formal Thought and the Sciences of Man in 1960. The 9 chapters that make up this work analyze the diversity of these receptions of Bachelard's epistemology. So there is a first part on the history of science and technology, where you could find chapters from Samuel Talcott and Sophie Roux examining Canguilhem's reception of Bachelard, and a third chapter by Ronan Leroux studying Bachelard's reception by historians and philosophers of technology specifically. There is a second part on the reception of Bachelardian epistemology within French Marxism, with 2 chapters by Audrey Benoit and Simone Mazouric examining the references to Bachelard in Pour Marx and Lire le Capital, and situating these chapters within the trajectories of the authors of these volumes and the history of French Marxism. There is a third part on the reception of Bachelardian epistemology in sociology with 2 chapters, one from Elsa Rambaud, examining Pierre Bourdieu's reception of Bachelard, and my chapter on Jean-Claude Passeron, Trajectory from this perspective. And there is finally a fourth part on the question of the imagination. So the choice we made, as the title indicates, is to focus on the reception of Bachelard's epistemology without delving deeply into the significant reception of his work on the imaginary. But even within this epistemological approach, it was possible to show, and this is what the chapters by Frédéric Fruteau de Laclos and Vincent Bontemps sets out to do, it was possible to show how the relationship between science and imagination has been conceived since Bachelard. one of the questions underlying this work is, in a certain sense, how does an author become canonical? What does it imply for an author to be widely cited and in such different circles who Marxism, sociology, philosophy of technologies are ordinarily studied separately? And we made the hypothesis that it would be fruitful to analyze the controversies surrounding references to Bachelard. That is, to ask how and against whom does one position oneself when claiming a Bachelardian legacy. And we uncovered a paradox in attempting to analyze these controversies between Bachelardians and anti-Bachelardians. That is that, on the one hand, upon closer examination, the self-proclaimed Bachelardians sometimes seemed to diverge considerably from Bachelard's position. And Sophie will explain how Canguilhem, beyond his overt tributes to Bachelard, appears to have held positions on the history of science and technology that seem very different from Bachelard's. And if we turn to Althusser, for instance, he engaged in self-criticism of his own Bachelardianism as early as 1972. And if we now turn to Bourdieu and Passeron, they both questioned in their own way whether Bachelardian epistemology was entirely suited to an epistemology of sociology. And so there is Simon Mazurik's chapter in this volume is entitled "We Althusser's Problematic Bachelardianism," and this apt expression of a problematic Bachelardianism could be applied to all the authors I have just mentioned. That is, that the reference to Bachelard is a legacy that, even when acknowledged, poses a problem, raises questions that this author will work with in order to gradually construct their own position. And then this other side of this paradox is that on the other hand, when we turn to the self-proclaimed anti-Bachelardians, we can nevertheless, in some cases, detect underlying forms of Bachelardian heritage. So, for instance, we could consider in that perspective the works of Bruno Latour or Michel Serres, who may have had very harsh words for Bachelardian epistemology, but who thought both from within it and against it, as shown, for instance, by Latour's use of the concept of phenomenotechnics. So we wanted to highlight the plurality of forms of reference to Bachelard, their polarizing effects with Bachelardians and anti-Bachelardians, while emphasizing that the division between the two camps is never as clear as one might think. So our hypothesis is that in the 1960s, Bachelard became an author from which one starts, whether in order to give an unexpected extension to some of his concept or method, or to criticize him and seek to open other paths for the history and philosophy of science and technology. So I'll stop here for the general presentation in order to leave time for Sophie to present her chapter. And if we have time, I'll say a word of my own chapter on Jean-Claude Passeron.
Thank you, Lucie. So I'm going to share my screen. So is it okay for everybody? Yes. Okay. So as Lucie alluded to, I will simply present my own paper, which is one of the three papers in the first section of the book. This section, and Lucie said it already, is devoted to the reception of Bachelard by the French epistemologist, and Canguilhem plays a leading role in this section. He is the subject of Samuel Talcott's paper, which focuses especially on the link between Bachelard and Canguilhem. He plays also an important role in Ronan Leroux's paper on the place of scientific instrument among Bachelard. And as indicated on the handout, my own paper is on the issue of the historicity of the sciences in Canguilhem. So it's generally agreed that the sciences are historical. A scientific result can be dated, it can be related to other contemporary events, whether these are scientific, cultural, or social. But such a link between the sciences and general history is quite weak. There is indeed no human phenomenon that is not historical in that sense. And attributing this weak historicity to the sciences is of no consequence on how history of science is to be written. However, if scientific progress is taken into account, the historicity of the sciences means, I think, something much stronger. In that case, it has to be explained how a scientific domain goes, to put it bluntly, from less to more knowledge, how progress happens in the sciences. For the so-called French epistemologists who claim to be followers of Bachelard, these two historicities, the weaker and the stronger, were together key for understanding the sciences. The question for them was indeed both to give scientists the freedom to act as human beings generally do, and in this sense to include history of science in their general concept of history, and to take into account the fact that history of science is a history sui generis because of its progress. So today I will disentangle Canguilhem concept of the historicity of the sciences in 4 steps. I begin by qualifying the importance of Bachelard recurrent, which leads me to suggest that we should read Canguilhem sometimes independently of Bachelard. Then I explain the reason why Canguilhem asserted that the history of science should be written as an adventure, which at first glance sounds very romantic. Third, I establish that the source of scientific progress is, according to him, the excess of the actions accomplished by the scientists with respect to their knowledge. And fourth, I recall how he conceived of the relation between technology and science, and argue that this could be applied as well to the relationship between science in the making and ready-made science. And if I have time, there will be a Cartesian bonus in conclusion. The thesis that Bachelard defended in 1951 in the talk L'actualité de l'histoire des sciences, as well as in the first chapter of L'activité rationaliste de la physique contemporaine, are probably well known to you, but I will recall them nevertheless. First, Bachelard argues, and this in a prescriptive manner, the history of science is unique in that, unlike general history, it must be written as the history of a progress. And it follows from that, second, that unlike general history, which prohibits anachronism, the history of science must be written starting from the present and going back to the past. This is what Bachelard calls recurrence, namely the operation that returns from the present to the past to distinguish between what was positive in the past, because it contributed to the emergence of today's science, and what was negative, because it didn't contribute to it. This amounts to establish a demarcation between, on the one hand, what Bachelard calls the outdated past, le passé périmé, the past that science has left behind, and its sanctioned past, le passé sanctionné, its past that is still present. However, Bachelard adds, not every recurrence is legitimate. Recurrence is legitimate if and only if the science in question has truly become a science. And for Bachelard, it means most of the time that it has become a science through mathematization. So why do have these theses to be qualified? Mainly for two reasons. In the first place, the two papers in which Bachelard defended this thesis were only texts of circumstance. And for about 15 years, nobody paid any attention to them. L'actualité de l'histoire des sciences were a lecture given to promote history of science in the general public. It was not commented on until the mid-60s, and we know this lecture today mainly because it was included in a collection of Bachelard papers edited by Canguilhem in 1971, Lucie mentioned. As for the first chapter of l'activité rationaliste de la physique contemporaine, unlike the other chapters, it was not discussed at all in any of the reviews that were given of this book. So it was not Bachelard himself, but his immediate contemporary, nor his immediate contemporaries, but the Bachelardians of the 60s, who established recurrence as their official method. The tribute that Canguilhem paid to Bachelard after his death in 1963, the papers published by those who took part to the seminar on the methods of the history of science that Canguilhem organized from 1964 to 1966, were decisive in this respect. But, and this is my second qualification, which is somehow paradoxal, and it is that while giving recurrence the status of an official method, the Bachelardians marked its limit quite strongly. First, to summarize the quotation on the slides, and I kept the quotation in French, but I'm going each time to translate or to summarize what is important. The demarcation of what Bachelard calls the outdated and the sanctioned prohibits the apprehension of the past of the sciences. To put it in the form of a dilemma, either we are dealing with the past of the sciences, and here I underline of the sciences, and then this past is present insofar as it has been sanctioned by the present sciences, so that in fact it's no longer past. Or the other horn of the dilemma, we are dealing with the past of the sciences, and now I underline past, And then this past, insofar as it is outdated, is no longer the past of the sciences. Moreover, the demarcation between the outdated and the sanctioned prevents us from apprehending the present sciences. Indeed, what is outdated in today's science may have acted in the past, so that today's science would not be what it is if it had not inherited not only some sanctioned element from yesterday's science, but also some of its outdated elements. The second group of problem came from the fact that Bachelard gave a privilege to the mathematization of a discipline to identify the point from which to carry out a recurrence. Clearly, mathematization cannot serve as an index of scientificity for all disciplines. It's well known that because Canguilhem worked on medicine and the life sciences, he has to suggest that recurrence should be transformed according to discipline. But of course, if recurrence varies according to circumstances, disciplinary inscriptions, it's not anymore a method in the sense of a systematic protocol established to reach with certainty some result. And in fact, the Bachelardians wrote that the choice of the point from which to carry out a recurrence is a free decision, and that it is an act that cannot be justified except by the result obtained. But then again, a good recurrence is simply a recurrence that makes it possible to write a good story. This is not a method in the strong term of the term. So, conclusion of my first point, if we focus on only a few texts from Canguilhem, in particular his tribute to Bachelard, one can end seeing him only as an heir to Bachelard, or even as a mere intermediate link between Bachelard and Foucault. Like Bachelard, Canguilhem insisted indeed on the sui generis character of the history of science as a history of a progress. But while he contributed to establish recurrence as the method of this historical epistemology, I just showed that he pointed out the aporias to which it led the historians. So I think that we have to understand Canguilhem's concept of the historicity of the sciences in its own terms. Looking at what Canguilhem writes about historians, the cause of history seems to be off to a very bad start. Indeed, Canguilhem presents historians as erudite chroniclers who compile series of facts to commemorate past legacies and to deliver certificates of scientific priority. Yet, when he talks about the history of science, he promotes history against the sciences. This is the case in his very first paper as a historian of science, La théorie cellulaire, in 1946. The beginning of this paper, this is the first quotation of the slide, maintains that, I quote, the benefit of a well-understood history of science is to reveal history in science, saying then that history involves a sense of possibility. Canguilhem adds, to know is not so much to come up against a reality as to validate a possibility by making it necessary. In these conditions, the genesis of the possible is as important as the demonstration of the necessary. The prevalence of the possible over the necessary is again emphasized in the conclusion of this paper, that the other quotation of the slide I translate: the present need for a more flexible and comprehensive theory can only surprise minds incapable of seeking in the history of science a sense of theoretical possibilities different from those which the teaching of only the latest scientific results has made familiar to them, that is, this mind, a sense, the sense of theoretical possibility, without which there can be neither scientific criticism nor any future for science. In his PhD, La formation du concept de réflexe in 1955, a similar idea is formulated in a prescriptive mode. I translate the end of the quotation in bold. The history of science must be written as a history and not as a science, as an adventure and not as a development. We must then reverse what Bergson calls a retrograde movement of truth and put in the future the eternal truth which is to come. And the French expression is mettre à l'avenir la future vérité de toujours. For Bergson, the retrograde movement of truth is our tendency to believe falsely that a true judgment has always been true. To reverse this movement, and as the enigmatic formula I quoted puts it, to put in the future the eternal truth which is to come, means returning to the historical moment when this truth was not yet a truth, when it had not yet been verified, when its truthness was a mere possibility. Here again, we have a precedence, a prevalence of the possible over the necessary, of adventure as a navigation through possibilities over development as a necessary unfolding of predetermined steps. So, to understand what is at stake when Canguilhem writes that the history of science must be written as a history and not as a science, as an adventure and not as a development, we can refer to the beginning of the quotation. So I'm going to summarize it, and basically it says that two kinds of norms have to be distinguished. On the one hand, the norms that rule, let's say, ordinary scientists, and on the other, the norms that rule historians of science. Ordinary scientists aim for objects that are embedded in already verified propositions characterized by impersonal necessity. Historians of science, on the other hand, must restore the unfinished project for which an exceptional scientist bore personal responsibility. In other words, most scientists deal with the already made norms of an already made science deals with the normative norms that some scientists of the past wish to establish when they projected themselves in the future. So, conclusion of my second step, the statement that the history of science must be written as an adventure is founded on a duality between two sets of terms. On the one hand, there is an already made science. It is to be found in textbooks dealing with necessary impersonal propositions. But on the other hand, there is science in the making, and it deals with personal projects that are formulated in not yet verified propositions. And this is one of the places where there is a difference between Bachelard and Canguilhem, because Bachelard assimilated with Récurrent the norms of the history of science with the norms of science, while, as we just saw, Canguilhem insisted on the contrary, on their difference. So now the next step, of course, is to explain why human beings are capable of having adventures. Adventures basically stem from actions that are carried out blindly without knowing what we are doing. And therefore, they can lead to errors, mistakes, and failures. But they are characteristic for what we do in history of science and as we will see more generally in life. In 1956, Canguilhem drew a distinction between two forms of experience. And you have to remember that in French, expérience is the term which is used both for experience and for experiment. On the one hand, he says there is experience, let's say, as a lesson that one wants to impose on others, especially on younger persons. On the other, there is experience, as he said, as an attempt whose outcome is presumed without being seen, a trial which risks to fail. Experience as a lesson is an illusion. No matter how hard you try, you rarely succeed in passing on your experience to others. Experience as a trial, on the other hand, in English one could say experimentation, is an adventure, a gamble, a test, and a risk that we never stop running with each new encounter and throughout our life. It is the very condition of living being, especially human being, to experiment in this way. Life, he wrote in 46, 47, is experimentation, that is to say, improvisation, the capacity to make use of what is encountered. It is an attempt in all directions. In line of the philosophy of life he was developing at this time, he presented science as a manifestation of life and the undertakings of scientists as an adventure of life. I quote from the first piece on the slide: the birth, development, and progress of science must be understood as a kind of adventurous undertaking of life. But because it is carried out through blind and obscure actions, adventure carries with it the risk of failure. I quote the somewhat late paper, Questionner idéologie scientifique in 1970. The progress of new scientific knowledge requires, in the future as in the past, a certain prevalence of intellectual adventure over rationalization, a presumptuous excess by the demands of life and action of what should have been already known and verified with caution and suspicion. So the notion of scientific ideology is new, it's quite specific in this paper, but Canguilhem was here simply using a scheme that we established long before. Successes and errors, visionary anticipation, and scientific ideology all have one and the same source, the fact that the actions of a scientist exceed knowledge. The quotation I just gave speak of presumptuous excess by the demands of life and action. And it's presumptuous because it goes beyond what these scientists know. In 1967, while teaching on action, Canguilhem says that one of the conditions of the progress of knowledge is the anticipation, the excess, again by action, again, of what the action should have contained of true knowledge in order to be effective when it was undertaken. So again, we have a duality, what we know for certain because it has been subjected to procedure of verification, but also what goes beyond what is known. Action being precisely that, what goes beyond what we know in a presumptuous and reckless way. So, according to Canguilhem, you have this duality, and adventure, action, and life have exactly the same characteristic. On the one hand, they bring out something new, they make it emerge, they create it. On the other hand, they are carried out blindly, and this is why they are open to failure, which means error in the scientific knowledge. Canguilhem post-war thinking on the history of science as an adventure that could fail can be traced back to two pre-war papers devoted to technology, Descartes et la technique, 37, and Activité technique et création, 38. In these two papers, Canguilhem criticized the positivist precept according to which science comes from prediction and prediction from action. And he asserted the autonomy of technology with respect to science. And unsurprisingly for you, perhaps now, he attributes to technology the same characteristic as those he will later attribute to adventure and action, namely the positive power to create something new, and on the other hand, the negative power to fail and to hurt. At this point, the question could be whether Canguilhem believed that every scientific innovation comes from technologies. This is not the case. On the contrary, it seems to me that for Canguilhem, the duality I highlighted is more fundamental than the terms to which it applies, so that he was ready to give to the sciences in the making the same characteristics as to technology. This is what appeared in and some unpublished reflections on creation. I am here referring to the chapter Création of a work written between 29 and 31, but not published. And in this chapter, Canguilhem explains why scientific truth should be seen as resulting from an individual creation, exactly as an artistic work. This is the first quotation on the slide. And already at that time, Canguilhem breaks creation down into two elements which correspond to the duality that I have identified. And another manuscript entitled Vocation, Valeur et Création, with no indication of date, explains, I translate from the second text on the slide, all creation involves a dream that is more precisely an anticipation, a presumption, and work. That is an effort towards realism, which is no longer a dream at all, which involves all the seriousness and all the drama of attention, obstinacy, criticism, and control. So what I wanted to insist on is the fact that there is a profound duality which structured Canguilhem's thought. Before the war, he attributed to technology a chronological primacy over the sciences, which need to have materials on which to exert their reflections. This doesn't mean, as I just said, that there is no creation in the sciences, but that a scientist begins by creating something new by obscure, blind actions before putting into place his or her reflections to regiment, as it were, these actions. And this duality, I think, contains an answer to the question about history CPI started with. History of science is part of general history because it is rooted in the actions of human beings. And it proceeds exactly in a sense as when we act in the most common sense. And it's also marked by freedom. But it's also a history of progress because scientists carry out a reflexive work which, to come back to the last text I just quoted, include all the seriousness and drama of attention, obstinacy, criticism, and control. Conclusion with, if you wish, the Cartesian bonus, history of science should respect two constraints for Canguilhem. First, it had to conform to a general conception of history according to which human beings can act freely to create new things, but it had also to account for scientific progress. Canguilhem felt that these two constraints were respected if history of science was conceived as a process whereby scientists establish their own norms. And the key notion here is that of internal normativity, which obviously contradicts the usual distinction between the descriptive and the normative. But as I understand Canguilhem, historians of science must accept this internal normativity if they don't want to be condemned to understanding scientific progress as the discovery of already existing idealities. And why there is a Cartesian bonus? It is because one could ask oneself whether there is anywhere in the history of philosophy a doctrine that is adequate to this concept of history, according to which scientists create by their actions novelties that they later on turn into necessary truth. It is well known that Descartes, in letters to Mersenne of the early 30s, asserted that God creates eternal truth in the manner of a king who establishes laws in his kingdom. If God is the author of the essence as well as of the existence of creatures, and not just the author of their existence, as was most often argued in the 17th century, there is literally no norm that pre-exists divine creation. But Descartes says that doesn't prevent truth from being true norms once they have been created, as he said in a letter to Mélan in 1644, from which the second quotation on the slide is taken. Eternal truths are not necessarily necessary, since God wills them freely, but this doesn't prevent them from being necessary, because they are, as it were, true truth. So you might think, and this is really the last slide, that this comparison between Canguilhem's concept of the historicity of the sciences and Descartes' doctrine of the eternal truth is perfect. It is not. On the contrary, so to conclude my talk, I will explain why it's well-founded. First, the conceptual problem is exactly the same. In both cases, the state is to account for the institution of new norms without referring to already existing norms. Descartes wanted eternal truth, but he didn't want God dealing with truth independent from him. It would have amounted, he said, to talk about God as a Jupiter or Saturn. Similarly, Canguilhem wanted some scientific progress, but he didn't want scientists discovering already pre-existing truth. As I said, he wanted scientists to be free to create new things. And to suppose that scientists only discover pre-existing truth would have amounted to deny freedom to them in their intellectual actions and in their scientific adventures. Second, from an historical point of view, Canguilhem had been a pupil of Léon Brunswick, who taught Descartes doctrine of the eternal truth, and at Brunswick's request, Canguilhem even translated from Latin Boutroux, another French professor, Des vérités éternelles selon Descartes. And Canguilhem had also been a pupil of Alain, who, to put it bluntly, secularized the doctrine of the creation of eternal truth to understand artistic creation. And traces of this secularization can be found in some of Canguilhem's texts on creation, which I commented. That's the end. Sorry, I was a bit longer than expected.
It's okay. I think. Thank you very much, Sophie. I think we have time for Lucie to give us a perspective also on her contribution, and maybe we just make sure that there's at least 20 minutes for discussion or something like that. Okay, so.
Yes, thanks. Do you see my screen? Good. So I only take a few minutes to say a few words on my own chapter, Jean-Claude Passeron on the critique of naturalist bachelardianism in sociology, where I trace the epistemological journey of Jean-Claude Passeron from the craft of sociology, Le métier de sociologue, 1968, to sociological reasoning, first published in 1991. And I compare these works and follow this trajectory by studying the evolution of references made to Bachelard. I assume that the craft of sociology, the work written with Pierre Bourdieu and Jean-Claude Passeron, embodies a rather orthodox form of Bachelardian thought. So if we follow the book structure, we see that it is guided by the project of systematically transposing Bachelardian epistemological concept to sociology. For instance, there are chapters on the construction of the sociological objects, on the break with common social knowledge, and chapters on the epistemological obstacles to the development of sociological knowledge. So as a whole, this book claims that sociology will attain the status of a science to the extent that it can break with spontaneous knowledge and construct its own objects of study by using appropriate methods of objectification, such as statistical analysis tools. And then by studying the texts that Passeron published later, some of which were including in sociological reasoning, I wanted to show that Passeron, without abandoning this reference to Bachelard, called for particular vigilance regarding the risks inherent in what he calls an overly naturalistic understanding of this reference. And here we have to understand what is meant by naturalism, which could be quite a polysemic notion. Passeron implies by naturalism the tendency to transpose the epistemology of the natural sciences too hastily to the epistemology of the social sciences without sufficiently examining the epistemological specificity of the latter disciplinary group. With that in mind, Passeron progressively affirmed an epistemological pluralism that led him to distinguish more clearly between the epistemology of what he calls the logico-mathematical sciences, then the epistemology of the experimental sciences, and last, the epistemology of the historical and social sciences. So ultimately, Passeron developed not one, but three epistemologies. And I thought it was worthwhile to examine the place that Bachelard occupied in each of them. And what's interesting when we study that is that in Passeron's work, the reference to Bachelard intersects with other references, notably references to Max Weber or Karl Popper. And I wonder how this eclecticism, in a way, nourished the development of Passeron's own concepts. So my question was what remained, especially of Bachelardian thought, in Passeron's effort to develop an epistemology that would be better suited to the specificity of social and historical sciences. And I will focus on a part of this chapter, focusing on Passeron's use of the Bachelardian concept of epistemological break or epistemological rupture in Le Savant et le Populaire, which could be translated as The Scholar and the Popular, which is a book published in 1989, and it takes the form of a conversation with Claude Grignon on the conditions for developing a sociology of popular culture. And this provides an example of the way in which Passeron still refers to Bachelard, but in a way which makes an original use of his thesis in order to analyze the specificity of social sciences. So what we can notice is that he shows in this work that there is a necessity of making several successive breaks, epistemological breaks or ruptures, and this alone would remain compatible with what Bachelard wrote. But he further argues that this series of ruptures must lead to a multiplication of divergent and, strictly speaking, incompatible approaches, each of which sheds a partial light on the phenomena under investigation. And so he advocates for a strong kind of pluralism. It's not only what I referred to earlier, that is an epistemological pluralism, the need to develop distinct epistemologies for the logical, mathematical sciences, experimental sciences, and historical and social sciences. There is further a pluralism proper to the historical and social sciences, which, according to Passeron, must cultivate a theoretical and methodological pluralism. So there is the idea that no approach to social phenomena, however fruitful, could radically prevail over competing approaches, and each of these approaches contribute in their own way to eliminating other aspects of social phenomena. And so he stressed that the social sciences cannot possess the same theoretical unity as sciences like physics or chemistry. According to Passeron, they must cultivate a plurality of approaches that cannot be reconciled in a theoretical synthesis, but whose coexistence is required if we have to grasp socio-historical phenomena in their richness and singularity. And so this is in that perspective that it calls for a series of epistemological breaks in the study of popular culture, especially. And so I will present this series of breaks. So the first break required if we want to make a sociology of popular culture is, according to Passeron, a break aiming at escaping class ethnocentrism. So Passeron stresses that any sociologist, having cultivating at least during their higher education a certain relationship to culture that differs from that of what we could call the working class, has a spontaneous tendency to cast an external and disparaging gaze upon popular cultures or popular relations to culture. And so the first break wants to overcome this tendency by cultivating a form of cultural relativism, which allows us to fully consider popular cultures as cultures in the strong sense of the term. But after that, he claims that this new perspective in turns presents an aporia. That is, he writes that we cannot stick to a relativistic approach to cultural practices in a society where not all relationships to culture are equal. He says that our societies aren't relativistic at all, so our sciences cannot be relativistic. So he claims that we must fully acknowledge that popular cultures are dominated cultures, socially positioned as inferior to the legitimate culture of the dominant classes. And so we must examine the forms of this domination. And so what's to be noticed here is that according to Passeron, the relativist approach on the one side and the study of forms of domination on the other side are both necessary for a fair study of popular culture, but they are irreconcilable. So he writes that studies in terms of cultural domination have blind spots that relativist approaches reveal, and vice versa. So in Bachelardian terms, there is no harmonious dialectic or any philosophy of no where these two approaches could be integrated into a theoretical synthesis. And we must remain, according to Passeron, within this kind of discomfort of two antagonistic approaches, each partial and biased in its own way, but both of which are fruitful in the study of popular cultures. And so we see Passeron defending in his epistemology of the social sciences a kind of theoretical pluralism that goes further, in my opinion, than the regional rationalism that Bachelard wrote about in the Rationalisme appliqué. Because Bachelard certainly recognized that scientific rationality developed along a plurality of paths, but he retained the idea that sooner or later, the moment would come for the theoretical synthesis that would unify these different approaches in a more general theory, of which they would be particular cases. But Passeron considers that this may well be the case in disciplines like mathematics, physics, or chemistry, but not, he affirms, in the historical and social sciences. And so I will conclude by stating that this example shows how an author like Passeron could have been deeply nourished by Bachelardian epistemology when he began his career as a sociologist, and ultimately felt the need to widen the gap between the epistemology of the natural sciences and the epistemology of the social sciences. And as he tried to do that, to stand for epistemological pluralism, he still kept referencing to Bachelard, even in his epistemology of social sciences, trying to elaborate what he calls a non-naturalist Bachelardianism, that is, a reception of Bachelard's work that takes into account the epistemological specificity of the social sciences. Thanks a lot. I leave time for discussion.
Thank you, Lucie. Well, excellent. Thank you both for taking us through the book, which I had forgotten to show. I have the actual physical copy with a nice yellow cover, and that I enjoyed very much reading. I want to open the floor right away for discussion and comments. So feel free to raise your hand and take your chance to interact with Lucie and Sophie.